In a locked drawer at the Providence Historical Society, a glossed silver print dated March 1904 sleeps like a curse. Three people pose in a velvet-drowned parlor: Jonathan Underwood, his wife Beatrice, and the quiet woman they have just hired. Look closer. Do not blink. The maid's right hand grips the chair back, cross-hatched with pale scars. Mark's memory refuses to heal. Those same markings recur in sworn statements from 1904 to 1928. 16 witnesses describing the last companion of prosperous wives who later met accidents at home. A photograph meant for bookkeeping will name a predator the city never saw. Before the veil lifts, anchor yourself to it. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to bind your courage to this investigation. If forbidden history already lives in you, subscribe now and mark your location in the comments. I want a constellation of witnesses around this story, so when the lights go out, we can still see one another. Providence, 1904. New England's second heart, pumping wealth through textile mills, jewelry factories, and railroads. Gas flames purr along cobblestones. The harbor air tastes of iron and salt. On Federal Hill, facades preen. Bay windows gulp sunlight. Ironwork curls like calligraphy. The Underwoods are the emblem of that polished age. Jonathan sells precision, gauges and valves that keep trains pretending time is orderly. Beatrice tends spectacle, crystal catching afternoon light, the etiquette of calling cards, a mahogany dining table. Yet palaces still need coal shoveled, lamps trimmed, brass persuaded to shine, linens starched to stiffness. Prosperity is built on hands not your own. Enter the maid, hired by advertisement and references written on paper, expensive enough to lie. She arrives in a sober dress, a small leather satchel, and that hand, a rare somme of scar. Her voice is Irish weather, her eyes arithmetic. She speaks of delicate ladies, of headaches, palpitations, nerves. She knows gas fixtures intimately, which valves sigh at midnight, which mantles brighten before they poison. She knows stoves that smoke and stare, runners that shift. Beatrice feels understood for the first time in a season. Jonathan, relieved, believes the household has found its rhythm again. The camera waits on a side table, its cyclops eye opening for a breath. Click, silver catches their hands. The husband's rests on the wife's shoulder. The wife's fold. The maid's claims the chair, and Providence inhales, unaware that a catastrophe has just developed to paper. Spring 1904 dressed Providence in lacework light, but inside the Underwood mansion, something more intricate than seasons began unfolding. The new maid, who gave her name as Elizabeth Hayes, rose before dawn as though she had lived in the house long before she was hired. Coal fires burned obediently under her watch, meals emerged precise to Jonathan's tastes, and not a single brass knob resisted her polish. To any visitor, she was the perfect instrument in the symphony of a Victorian household. But Elizabeth's true genius did not bloom in daylight. It came alive in the hours when silence reigned and the mansion breathed in its sleep. Victorian homes were not merely structures of wood and brick. They were bodies, veins of gas pipe, lungs of ductwork, hearts of boilers and stoves. Few mistresses or masters grasped these mechanics. Elizabeth, however, charted them with an engineer's hunger. She traced each hiss of gas, each rattle of a vent, memorizing where invisible poisons could be coaxed into drifting unseen. With patience sharpened by practice, she learned every nerve of the Underwood home until she could wound it invisibly, at will. To Jonathan, she seemed angelic. He praised her ability to anticipate his habits, remarking how his morning coffee always bore the precise bitterness he craved. To Beatrice, she was confidante and nurse, always hovering with gentle tones and whispered remedies. "Your head aches from too much light, Mrs. Underwood," Elizabeth would murmur as she adjusted the curtains. "Rest more. The world demands too much of you." Slowly, she engineered not just the house, but its inhabitants. Jonathan found his wife retreating from gatherings she once adored, citing fatigue, then nervous exhaustion. Callers arrived only to be told by Elizabeth that Mrs. Ann Underwood could not rise from bed. Bit by bit, Beatrice's lively social world shrank until it fit within the walls of the house, and within Elizabeth's control. By late May, Beatrice confessed to her new maid of haunting dream suffocation, tumbling into endless dark, waking in drenched terror. Elizabeth listened with devoted patience, her scarred hand smoothing Beatrice's hair. She suggested the gas lamp in the bedroom was to blame. Old fixtures breathe badly at night. She promised to adjust it for her mistress's comfort. That night, Elizabeth's fingers twisted the valve with surgical precision, leaving a leak so slight that no flame faltered, but enough to seed Beatrice's sleep with dread. The Underwoods believed they had employed salvation. In truth, they had invited into their home the slow architecture of death. On the night of May 29, 1904, Jonathan Underwood dined with railroad investors downtown, leaving his wife in Elizabeth's company. The maid suggested a smaller meal in the breakfast room rather than the intimidating length of the dining table. Beatrice agreed, too wary to protest. Dinner was delicate, roasted chicken glistening with herbs, vegetables arranged like a still life, and a modest bottle of wine Elizabeth recommended for nerves. Conversation flowed, but beneath Elizabeth's soft words ran an undertow of calculation. She spoke of past employers, ladies frail, anxious, undone by social burdens. Each story ended the same way. Poor thing, she never found peace until the end. Beatrice, already exhausted, recognized herself in those tales. Her confessions spilled like ink. How she felt trapped by social rituals, how expectation drained her marrow, how some invisible force pressed on her chest every night. Elizabeth's pale eyes soaked in every word, her scarred fingers occasionally closing over Beatrice's hand with a maternal tenderness that concealed steel. The mistress of the house believed she had found not just a servant, but a witness to her suffering. Later that evening, Elizabeth insisted on helping Beatrice prepare for bed. She brushed her hair with slow, meditative strokes, as though each strand carried a secret to untangle. She lit the bedroom lamp and adjusted the flame, her fingers knowing the valve's hidden language. The room filled with a soft glow, steady but slightly sour in the lungs. She kissed Beatrice's forehead like a blessing or a benediction and withdrew. Hours passed. Neighbors remembered that night as eerily still. At dawn, Elizabeth entered the hallway and screamed. Beatrice lay crumpled at the bottom of the grand staircase, her nightgown torn, her neck bent at a grotesque angle. Her grandmother's gold bracelet clung to her wrist, but the diamond earrings and sapphire brooch had vanished. Elizabeth's wailing drew half the street. She threw herself over the body, her voice shredded by grief, as though she were the bereaved, not the servant. Detective Captain William Brennan arrived with little more than a notebook and weary assumptions. Gas leaks, staircase falls, coal furnaces. These were the assassins of Providence homes. He marked it, tragic accident. Jonathan, summoned by telegram, collapsed into shock. He saw in Elizabeth, not suspicion, but devotion's a maid, red-eyed and trembling, clinging to his wife's corpse as though she had lost her own sister. The scars on Elizabeth's hand gleamed in morning light. Brennan noticed them, but dismissed them as kitchen relics. He did not know that those marks were history's signature, written again and again wherever Elizabeth Hayes had walked, and wherever wives had fallen. The Underwood funeral was whispered about for weeks. Carriages lined Federal Hill as Providence's aristocracy gathered to mourn Beatrice, their silk veils trembling like black wings in the May wind. Jonathan stood hollow-eyed, receiving condolences he could scarcely comprehend. Beside him hovered Elizabeth Hayes, discreet, efficient, and infinitely sympathetic. She managed condolences, letters, and meals, sparing Jonathan from decisions while quietly weaving herself deeper into his shattered household. To neighbors, she was the embodiment of loyalty. To Jonathan, she was indispensable. To history, she was a shadow tightening its hold. Elizabeth did not linger beyond necessity. By September, Jonathan announced he would abandon the mansion that now felt like a tomb. Elizabeth left with her satchel, as silent as she had arrived, clutching a glowing letter of reference praising her devotion in the family's darkest hours. No one suspected that she would return to Rhode Island under another name. No one realized she had simply rehearsed a pattern she had performed before, and would perform again. For the next decade, Providence society seemed stalked by bad luck. Wives of prominent men were discovered at the bottoms of staircases, in bedrooms thick with gas, in parlors where a simple fall had turned fatal. Jewelry went missing, explanations blurred, and grief silenced suspicion. Each tragedy bore the faint fingerprint of inevitability: a newly hired maid, an illness of the nerves, a sudden accident. To police, these were isolated misfortunes. To Elizabeth, they were a symphony of silence she conducted with precision. She shed names like Skin, Elizabeth Hayes in Providence, Catherine Lynch in Hartford, another alias in Boston. Each time she altered her appearance slightly. Different hairstyle, adjusted accent, fabricated references from families conveniently unreachable. She specialized in households where the mistress felt smothered by duty. She whispered understanding, offered remedies, and in time, prepared the stage for yet another fall. By the time investigators would connect her to 16 household tragedies, Elizabeth's legend had already burrowed into Providence folklore. They called her, in hushed tones, the Widowmaker. If you have followed this far, you are no longer just a listener. You are marked by the same forbidden truth that scarred Elizabeth's hand. Seal your place in this story now. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. It binds you to the unveiled, to those who dare look directly into history's hidden machinery. The photograph, forgotten in an archive, would one day whisper the secret. But first, Elizabeth had a decade left to haunt Providence's drawing rooms. When Elizabeth vanished from the Underwood household, Providence believed the story had closed. But predators do not retire, they adapt. By 1906, she had resurfaced in Hartford under the name Catherine Lynch. Her hair, once pinned with strict austerity, now curled softly to disguise her age. Her voice carried less Irish lilt, more polished Boston gentility. The forged references she carried dripped with praise, written on letterheads from cities where no one would bother to verify. Her new employer was Margaret Tillinghast, wife of a textile magnate whose fortune rose on the sweat of mill workers. Margaret was 20 years younger than her husband and unprepared for the suffocating rules of elite society. Balls exhausted her, teas drained her, and her anxieties multiplied inside the cavernous Gothic Revival mansion, where she was expected to reign as hostess. She needed rescue, and rescue appeared in the form of a discreet housekeeper named Catherine. Margaret leaned into Elizabeth's whispered advice: rest more. Refuse visitors. Silence your nerves. Soon her calendar thinned, her friends visited less, and her husband returned each evening to find her pale, grateful only for the comfort of her servants' gentle remedies. Elizabeth's routine was impeccable, but her true mastery lay in manipulation, disguising control as compassion. In December 1906, tragedy struck again. Margaret was found in her bath, her body blue from asphyxiation. The doctor called it an accident. Perhaps she had fainted, perhaps gas had seeped in. David Tillinghast grieved with numb disbelief. Catherine wept with such theatrical devotion that mourners praised her loyalty. Yet quietly, Margaret's diamond calm and sapphire pendant disappeared into Catherine's satchel. When suspicion threatened, Elizabeth shed Hartford like a snake's skin. By 1908, she was back in Rhode Island, a new name, a new story, her scars explained anew. Each household became a stage for her pattern: isolation, poisoning, accident, mourning, disappearance. For the city, these deaths blurred together as misfortunes of wealthy wives too fragile for modern life. For Elizabeth, they were trophies in silence. She had perfected the art of vanishing, leaving no trace but grief, and a photograph still waiting in a drawer. The first decade of the new century hummed with prosperity, but Providence whispered about the strangeness stalking its mansions. Too many wives died too young too suddenly, and always under the supervision of servants whose names shifted like shadows. Yet the police, bound by primitive methods and deference to wealthy men, never assembled the puzzle. Elizabeth thrived in this blindness. Each time she approached a new household, she studied its architecture as if dissecting a body. Gas lines became arteries she could constrict. Stairs transformed into vertebrae waiting to snap. Even electrical wires, newly threaded into old walls, offered opportunities for fire or shock. She turned technology itself into a weapon, using progress against those it was meant to serve. Her methods were never identical. Sometimes a wife tumbled down a staircase. Other times she succumbed to a mysterious illness, her lungs weakened by invisible fumes. Always Elizabeth's scarred hand was nearby, adjusting lamps, closing windows, preparing remedies in porcelain cups. And always, when the moment of discovery came, she was the first to scream. The pattern escaped detection for a reason: grief blinded men. Husbands who lost wives clung to Elizabeth, the loyal servant, the grieving witness. They praised her devotion, wrote her glowing references, and gave her money enough to vanish into the next city. What man, broken by loss, could imagine that the woman weeping over his wife's corpse had engineered the accident? By 1912, the tally was already grim, half a dozen women dead, each connected to a housemaid with the same scarred right hand. Yet the evidence lay scattered across time, never assembled into a single case. To Providence, Elizabeth Hayes was invisible. To history, she was becoming immortal. The years rolled forward, and the Widowmaker honed her craft with chilling precision. In 1914, she entered the employ of the Whitcombs, a family enriched by shipping. Their mansion smelled of salt air and mahogany, a labyrinth of gas-lit corridors where Elizabeth prowled like a warden. Mrs. Whitcomb, frail and restless, found in her maid both nurse and companion. Elizabeth encouraged solitude, discouraging visits, whispering that peace could only be found in silence. It was a silence Elizabeth engineered. One winter night, while her husband attended a harbor council meeting, Mrs. Whitcomb retired to her chamber. Neighbors later recalled a sharp odor in the air, but inside the house the gas lamp burned innocently. By dawn, Mrs. Whitcomb lay lifeless in her bed, her features relaxed as though she had been lulled into eternity. A doctor signed the death as heart failure, and Elizabeth once again played her role with award-worthy grief. By now, whispers were louder. Old servants muttered that a strange Irish woman seemed to appear in households just before tragedy. Some remembered her eyes pale and watchful. Others remembered the scars, the way she turned her hand palm down when asked to pass a dish. But no one had proof. The photograph in the Providence archive, her hand on the underwood chair, remained hidden, dust settling on its secret. Without that single frozen moment, suspicion dissolved into rumor, rumor into silence. Elizabeth's confidence grew. Each death made her bolder, each household easier to manipulate. By 1916, she no longer ran from suspicion. She erased it before it was born. By 1918, the Widowmaker's trail spanned Providence, Hartford, Boston, and beyond. At least a dozen deaths lay behind her, each stamped with the same quiet signature: a maid whose devotion suffocated, whose remedies poisoned, whose sympathy concealed theft. Yet still she walked unrecognized. The war years gave her cover. Husbands away on business or service left wives lonely and vulnerable. Elizabeth slipped into their homes like salvation, offering companionship in absence. When tragedy struck, who could question it? Families said grief, exhaustion, illness. Doctors nodded, scribbled, accident, and moved on. But the whispers grew teeth. Insurance companies began to notice patterns. Too many claims filed by wealthy men whose wives had fallen suffocated or simply weakened. Too often valuables had vanished without record. Too frequently, a new servant had been hired weeks before. Elizabeth felt the net stirring, though not yet closing. She grew sharper, crueler, more deliberate. The accidents no longer felt accidental, they carried artistry. Staircases oiled with care. Lamps adjusted for a slow, invisible leak. Medicine spiked just enough to weaken, never enough to alert. Each scene was crafted to appear natural, inevitable. And yet, her arrogance betrayed her. In one parlor, in one photograph taken years before, her hand rested where it should not, its scars glowing like a confession in silver nitrate. That image, long ignored, would one day expose her. But before we reach that revelation, you must prove you can bear it. Seal yourself to the unveiled once more. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. You will need the ritual, because the descent grows darker from here. Elizabeth's reign was about to collide with the one force she had not anticipated, greed sharper than her own. By 1918, the Widowmaker's trail spanned Providence, Hartford, Boston, and beyond. At least a dozen deaths lay behind her, each stamped with the same quiet signature: a maid whose devotion suffocated, whose remedies poisoned, whose sympathy concealed theft. Yet still she walked unrecognized. The war years gave her cover. Husbands away on business or service left wives lonely and vulnerable. Elizabeth slipped into their homes like salvation, offering companionship in absence. When tragedy struck, who could question it? Families said grief, exhaustion, illness. Doctors nodded, scribbled accident, and moved on. But the whispers grew teeth. Insurance companies began to notice patterns. Too many claims filed by wealthy men whose wives had fallen suffocated or simply weakened. Too often, valuables had vanished without record. Too frequently, a new servant had been hired weeks before. Elizabeth felt the net stirring, though not yet closing. She grew sharper, crueler, more deliberate. The accidents no longer felt accidental, they carried artistry. Staircases oiled with care. Lamps adjusted for a slow, invisible leak. Medicine spiked just enough to weaken, never enough to alert. Each scene was crafted to appear natural, inevitable. And yet, her arrogance betrayed her. In one parlor, in one photograph taken years before, her hand rested where it should not, its scars glowing like a confession in silver nitrate. That image, long ignored, would one day expose her. But before we reach that revelation, you must prove you can bear it. Seal yourself to the unveiled once more. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. You will need the ritual, because the descent grows darker from here. Elizabeth's reign was about to collide with the one force she had not anticipated, greed sharper than her own. Providence was changing. The war had ended, fortunes shifted, and even the old mansions felt uneasy in the new age. But Elizabeth, by then calling herself Mrs. Ellen Grant, found another stage for her performance. She entered the household of Dr. William Harrington, a physician with a sterling reputation, and a young wife, Clara. Clara was delicate, often alone, and far too trusting of the quiet housekeeper who seemed to know more about medicine than most nurses. Elizabeth administered teas, tonics, and rest cures that slowly pulled Clara deeper into weakness. But this time Elizabeth miscalculated. Dr. Harrington was no grieving textile heir or distracted shipping magnate. He was a man of science, observant, methodical, and suspicious by nature. He noticed Clara's pulse weakening after Elizabeth's special herbal mixtures. He noticed valuables missing from drawers. And one night, returning earlier than expected, he noticed the maid in his study, rifling through locked files. Elizabeth's mask cracked. Her weeping charm turned brittle under questioning. Harrington said nothing at first. He watched. When Clara collapsed one April morning, he refused to sign the death certificate. He demanded an autopsy. The results were damning traces of digitalis, a toxin derived from foxglove. Not enough to kill instantly, but enough to weaken Clara's heart over weeks. Elizabeth had not planned for a doctor who understood poison. The police were summoned, and Elizabeth was arrested under suspicion. Her fingerprints matched a woman wanted in Boston for theft. Her scarred hand betrayed her disguise. Providence newspapers roared with the headline, "The Widowmaker of Federal Hill." Yet fate intervened. On the way to trial, Elizabeth collapsed in her cell, convulsing violently. By dawn she was dead. Some whispered suicide by poison smuggled in. Others whispered she was silenced, that someone wealthier than her wanted her secrets buried forever. The truth never reached the court. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave, her true name never carved in stone. But the story did not end in 1919. A decade later, while cataloging archives at the Rhode Island Historical Society, a clerk found an old photograph from 1893, the Underwood parlor, the funeral scene. In the corner, nearly hidden by shadow, was a woman's hand resting on a chair. A scared hand. The photograph had captured Elizabeth's signature without her knowing. When compared with sketches from police files, the scar matched perfectly. At last, history had its proof. The mysterious maid, the vanished housekeeper, the alias shifting servant, they were all the same woman. But Providence did not celebrate. Instead, unease rippled. If Elizabeth had haunted the city's richest homes for over 2 decades, how many deaths had truly been hers? 16 were certain. Others remained whispers. Some said her count reached 30, perhaps more. The legend grew darker with each retelling. Mothers warned daughters, never trust the maid with the scarred hand. Servants whispered her ghost walked Federal Hill, still tending lamps, still carrying poison in porcelain cups. And so, the Widowmaker entered folklore, not as a cautionary tale of crime and punishment, but as a shadow that slipped through society's cracks. The veil is lifted now, and you have seen her face, her scar, her method. But to remain among the unveiled, you must claim your place. Type, "The veil is broken," in the comments to seal your fate, for the scarred hand is more than history. It is a warning that still reaches from the past, clutching at those who dare to remember. For years, Providence believed Elizabeth Hayes, the Widowmaker, died in that jail cell in 1919. The coroner declared it sudden heart failure, though no proper investigation was ever made. An unmarked grave was dug, a body lowered, and a name erased. But almost immediately, whispers began to spread. Some said the woman buried that day wasn't Elizabeth at all. The jailhouse matron swore the corpse's scars didn't match. The left hand bore burns, but they were smaller, more recent. Others swore the body was too young, the hair too dark. Was it possible Elizabeth bribed her way free, leaving behind a double to take her place? 2 years later, in 1921, a wealthy family in Philadelphia reported the strange death of their matriarch. A fall down a grand staircase, her jewels mysteriously missing. A maid under the name Margaret Allen vanished the next morning. Neighbors described her as tall, thin, with piercing gray eyes, and a scar across her hand. Coincidence, or proof the Widowmaker had simply slipped into another skin? By the late 1920s, American newspapers began printing strange reports from abroad. In London, a judge's wife was found dead near her gas lamp, her servant gone. In Paris, a widow drowned in her own bath, her jewels missing. Her new English maid vanished overnight. The French police even circulated a description: a middle-aged woman, gaunt, soft-spoken, with a scar across her palm. Could Elizabeth have fled overseas, her legend mutating as she threaded herself into Europe's old houses? Or was the scarred maid a phantom, copied by criminals who had studied her story? One chilling account surfaced in 1932, a letter from an Irish servant who swore she met Elizabeth, now calling herself Madame Elspeth, working in a boarding house in Dublin. Her eyes were ice. The servant wrote, "And when she touched my arm, I felt death in her fingers." The servant fled the house and never returned. Weeks later, the boarding house mistress was dead, officially from pneumonia. But the girl insisted Elizabeth Hayes walked Ireland's streets that winter. In 1946, long after Elizabeth's supposed death, another photograph surfaced in Providence. A local historian studying an estate sale discovered a portrait taken during a family gathering in 1927, 8 years after the Widowmaker's reported burial. In the far background stood a maid, blurred but distinct, tall, thin, a pale face. And though the photograph had faded, one detail cut through the grain like a knife. Her left hand, resting on a chair, showed a deep, unmistakable scar. How could a dead woman appear in a photograph almost a decade later, unless she was never buried at all? Some folklorists believe Elizabeth Hayes never died, but became something more than human. A ghost that refused to fade, feeding on sorrow, moving from house to house like a shadow carried in luggage. Families whispered of hearing her footsteps at night, of seeing a pale maid reflected in mirrors, of gas lamps flickering when no one touched them. Today, there are modern reports. Homeowners claiming to see a scarred woman lingering in old mansions in New England. Always in the servants' quarters, always waiting at the edge of the stairs. Some even swear she appears in photographs taken at weddings, funerals, and parties in Providence homes. Always in the background, never smiling, the Widowmaker, they say, is still at work.